Calvin Doc Harris had been working the night shift at the port for years, an unassuming man who kept to himself. But on one fateful evening, as the port lay cloaked in darkness, his life was brutally cut short. Found behind a shipping container, 2 gunshots to the back, cold and calculated. The discovery of his body sent ripples of fear through the community. What had seemed like another ordinary night at the docks quickly became a mystery that no one could ignore. What made Calvin's murder so chilling was the type of ammunition used. Ballistics experts soon identified it as a rare, foreign-manufactured round, a bullet typically reserved for cartel enforcement hits. It was a weapon tied to professional killers, not petty criminals. And that was just the beginning. Port logs revealed an even more disturbing detail. A suspicious cargo crate had been offloaded from a ship just hours before Calvin's death. The manifest, however, had been falsified, hiding the true contents of the crate. Something much more sinister was at play, and it appeared Calvin had been caught in the middle of it. Investigators soon connected the dots between the smuggled goods, the rare bullets, and a web of encrypted communications linking port employees to a larger criminal operation. This wasn't just a murder, it was a carefully orchestrated execution, pointing to a much deeper, more dangerous criminal network using the port as a drop-off point for illegal goods. As the investigation unfolds, more questions surface. Who could have wanted Calvin dead? What was he involved in that could have led to this brutal act? And how deep did the conspiracy go? This story, much darker than it first appeared, is only just beginning to reveal its true horrors. Calvin Doc Harris was a fixture at the port, a reliable, hard-working man who lived a quiet, unassuming life. He had been a longshoreman for over a decade, spending long hours unloading cargo ships, his hands worn and calloused from years of labor. To his colleagues, he was a familiar face, someone who knew the ins and outs of the job. While he wasn't one to seek attention, Calvin's presence was felt. He was dependable, someone you could count on in the harsh world of late-night dock work. But beneath his steady exterior, few truly knew what weighed on his heart. Calvin was a father, a son, and a brother. His family meant the world to him, and while his job kept him away for long stretches, he always made time to be there for his loved ones. He was protective of those he cared about, often quietly offering his support when things were tough. But his life was far from perfect. Like many longshoremen, Calvin worked night shifts to make ends meet, and the stress of those long hours began to take a toll on him. It wasn't just the physical strain of the work, but the uncertainty that hung over him, knowing that the world he operated in was full of secrets and shadows. As Calvin's death began to unravel, it became clear that the quiet man everyone thought they knew had likely been unknowingly caught in something far darker. His connection to the port and the strange events leading up to his death began to surface, leaving his family to wonder. Had Calvin been aware of the risks he faced? Was he merely a bystander to something far more dangerous? If you're intrigued by the twists and turns of Calvin's story, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. In our deep dives into real-life cases like this one, we investigate the secrets buried beneath the surface, uncovering the truths that others are too afraid to speak. Don't miss a single moment of this gripping investigation into the life and untimely death of Calvin Doc Harris. Calvin Doc Harris was not a solitary man, though his work at the port often kept him in the shadows. His life was defined by a series of quiet, yet significant, relationships, ones that shaped who he was and, ultimately, how he came to be involved in a deadly conspiracy. His colleagues at the port knew him as a reliable worker, one who kept his head down and did his job without complaint. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Among his fellow longshoremen, Calvin was well respected. He wasn't the loudest or most charismatic person in the crew, but his calm demeanor and dedication made him a steadying presence in the chaotic world of night shifts at the docks. He had a way of quietly earning the trust of those around him. People knew that when Calvin was on the job, it would be done right. But that sense of reliability often meant that he was overlooked, his role in the larger operations of the port going unnoticed by most of his peers. In the tight-knit community of the port, however, relationships were often more complex than they seemed. There was no shortage of tension between workers and management. The high-stress environment created opportunities for greed, resentment, and power struggles, particularly as the port served as a nexus for both legitimate commerce and shady dealings. Calvin had always kept his distance from any overt conflict. He didn't involve himself in disputes over cargo or port operations, but his interactions with others occasionally raised questions. A few of his co-workers noticed that, just days before his death, Calvin had appeared more uneasy than usual, like he was carrying a burden no one could see. His family, on the other hand, was the anchor of his world. Calvin's relationship with his wife and children was one of the few constants in his otherwise unpredictable life. Though the long hours often kept him away from home, he made sure to stay connected with his loved ones. He wasn't one for grand gestures or open displays of affection, but his actions spoke volumes. He worked tirelessly to provide for his family, ensuring that they had a better life than he did growing up. Despite his distance from home, Calvin was the steady provider, the dependable father figure that his children could rely on. But even with this strong familial foundation, cracks had begun to show. Calvin had become increasingly distant in the months leading up to his death. His wife noticed he had grown withdrawn, less engaged with his family. Late-night shifts became the norm, and even when he was home, he seemed lost in thought, as though something was weighing heavily on him. Calvin's colleagues, however, might have been closer to understanding what that burden was. His interactions with certain figures at the port, particularly one of the logistics managers, had raised eyebrows. While Calvin had always kept himself, it was noted that he had recently been seen speaking more frequently with this manager, an individual with a reputation for being involved in less than legitimate dealings. Was this a simple case of a worker getting involved with a higher-up, or was it something more? The secrecy surrounding these interactions only grew as the investigation into Calvin's murder deepened. In the wake of Calvin's death, his family began to sift through the fragments of his life. They were left to piece together the details of his relationships, trying to understand what had led him to his untimely demise. Was Calvin unknowingly involved in something dangerous, or had he been targeted for reasons no one could fully comprehend? And if so, who among the people closest to him knew more than they had let on? As investigators began to dig into Calvin's life, the tangled web of relationships at the port began to unravel. The more they uncovered about Calvin's interactions, both professional and personal, the more questions emerged. Was there a connection between the quiet longshoreman and the dark undercurrents of corruption that flowed beneath the surface of the port? Was Calvin a mere pawn in a much larger operation, Or was he actively involved in a dangerous game? It was a cold night when Calvin Doc Harris was found behind the shipping containers, his life extinguished by 2 well-placed shots. The port was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness, as workers began their shifts and the sound of containers being unloaded echoed in the distance. When Calvin didn't report for work the following evening, his absence raised only slight concern at first. After all, missing shifts weren't uncommon in such a demanding job. But by the 3rd day, alarm bells began to ring. His family hadn't heard from him, and there was no sign of him at the port. When the body was discovered, it became clear that Calvin's disappearance was far from a simple oversight. Behind a shipping container, hidden from plain sight, the investigation into his murder began. It was quickly evident that this was no random act of violence. The method of the killing was too precise, too deliberate. The 2 gunshots to Calvin's back had been executed with the kind of skill and intention that hinted at something far darker. The weapon used was particularly notable. Ballistics experts identified it as a rare, foreign-made round, commonly linked to cartel enforcement operations. This wasn't the weapon of a local thug. This was the signature of professionals, people who didn't leave things to chance. The implications were chilling. But it wasn't just the weapon that raised suspicions. Port logs, examined by investigators, revealed something even more concerning. A suspicious cargo crate had been offloaded just hours before Calvin's body was found, its contents hidden under a false manifest. A standard shipment on the surface, it was soon revealed to be anything but ordinary. The crate's arrival had been meticulously planned, with forged paperwork that masked its true nature. The timing was too coincidental, and the investigators quickly began to connect the dots between the mysterious cargo and Calvin's death. Further digging revealed encrypted communications between several port employees, including a logistics manager, which tied them to the crate's arrival. Homeland Security analysts were able to crack the code and uncover messages that pointed to a smuggling operation using the port as a drop-off point. This was the first real break in the case, and it made one thing clear. Calvin Harris was likely not just a victim of random violence. He had been caught in the middle of something much larger, a criminal network that operated in the shadows of the very infrastructure designed to protect and regulate the nation's ports. As investigators began to piece together these early warning signs, they began to question the nature of Calvin's involvement. Was he an innocent bystander, or had he unknowingly become entangled in a much larger conspiracy? The more they uncovered, the more they realized that Calvin's role at the port and the people he interacted with might hold the key to understanding why he had been targeted. Despite his quiet, reserved demeanor, Calvin's work at the port had brought him into contact with individuals who were connected to the criminal world. His relationship with certain key figures, including the logistics manager whose messages had been uncovered, was under intense scrutiny. Could Calvin have been drawn into the smuggling ring without his knowledge? Or had he become aware of something dangerous, leading to his brutal execution? As the investigation unfolded, the early warning signs began to point in one unsettling direction. The combination of the rare weapon, the falsified cargo manifest, and the encrypted messages suggested a level of coordination and sophistication that made it clear Calvin's murder was part of something far more intricate and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The port a seemingly innocent hub of commerce, was a crucial node in a much larger criminal network. And Calvin, whether intentionally or unknowingly, had paid the ultimate price. As the days passed, the tension surrounding Kellen Brooks only grew. His once peaceful existence, grounded in work and family, had been slowly consumed by shadows of doubt and fear. His visits to the mechanic's shop became more frequent, though no one could pinpoint why. The mechanic, who had long been suspected of having connections to a local gang, seemed to have drawn Kellen into a web of secrecy and suspicion. While there was no overt sign of hostility, the weight of Kellen's actions, coupled with his increasing unease, suggested something far darker was unfolding. The crime itself, brutal and cold, was executed with chilling precision. Kellen Brooks, on that fateful night, found himself in a situation he couldn't escape. His killer, seemingly knowing exactly where and when to strike, ran Kellen down with a vehicle, leaving his body lifeless in the middle of a desolate rural field. The scene was both eerily quiet and devastatingly violent, with no witnesses to the crime and only the twisted trail of evidence left behind. It seemed at first like a random hit and run, a tragic accident that could have happened to anyone. But as investigators combed through the scene, they discovered that this was no accident. What at first seemed like a reckless crime now appeared carefully orchestrated. The vehicle that had struck Kellen was later found burned out, a charred wreck abandoned in a nearby field. At first, this seemed like an attempt to destroy evidence, but what the fire investigators uncovered would change everything. In the midst of the wreckage, a critical clue was discovered, an unusual tire brand that had survived the intense flames. The fire had consumed nearly everything else, but the tire was intact, marked with a rare defect pattern. It was an odd detail, seemingly insignificant at first glance, but it would prove to be the key that unlocked the mystery of Kellen's death. This rare tire, so distinct and so easily traceable, was soon linked to a local mechanic. The same mechanic who had been seen with Kellen in the days leading up to his death. Investigators learned that the mechanic had a history with vehicles and a deep connection to the criminal world, links to a gang involved in various illegal activities. But it was not just the mechanic's criminal ties that raised suspicion. The tire's defect pattern was unique, only available from a particular distributor that catered to a select group of clients. This link, once found, sent investigators down a path they had not anticipated, uncovering a chain of events that had been set into motion long before Kellen's life was cut short. The more investigators dug, the clearer it became that Kellen's murder was not a spur-of-the-moment crime. This was a calculated act. Someone had taken the time to plan, to cover their tracks, and to leave behind a trail of clues. The fire was not just a way to destroy the car. It was a deliberate attempt to mislead the investigation, to confuse the authorities and force them into thinking it was an accident. But with the tire's distinct defect pattern, that plan was about to fall apart. The tire pattern, once traced back to the mechanic, raised further suspicions. A financial audit of the mechanic's business revealed a startling discovery. Large cash deposits made in the days leading up to Kellen's murder. These deposits, unusual and unaccounted for, pointed to something far more sinister, a possible payment for services rendered. The mechanic, whose ties to gang activity were already known, seemed to be at the center of it all. But was he working alone? The investigation had only just begun, but the pieces were slowly starting to fall into place. The detectives' instincts told them that the tire, the mechanic's involvement, and the financial transactions were not mere coincidences. Kellen had become entangled in a web of criminal activity that had escalated beyond his control. The evidence, while still mounting, was clear. This was no random tragedy. Kellen's murder had been orchestrated, and those responsible had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. But there was one more piece of the puzzle that had yet to fall into place. In the coming days, investigators would uncover another crucial piece of evidence. Hidden footage from a garage camera that would reveal the mechanic's role in the crime. The truth, though still elusive, was drawing nearer with each passing moment. The discovery of Calvin Doc Harris's body sent shockwaves through the port community. The quiet man, who had been a steady presence in the lives of his colleagues for over a decade, was now gone. His sudden, violent death created a sense of unease that spread far beyond the confines of the shipping docks. His coworkers, once accustomed to a steady rhythm of work, found themselves grappling with an unspoken fear. How had this happened? Who would want to kill someone so ordinary, so reliable? It was a question that lingered in the minds of everyone who knew Calvin, but the answers seemed elusive. At the port, whispers began to circulate. Some employees speculated that Calvin had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others, however, began to suspect something far darker. The discovery of the rare bullets and the strange circumstances surrounding the cargo crate hinted at a conspiracy, and many at the port felt the heavy weight of a shadow now hanging over their workplace. Fear of retaliation from those responsible for Calvin's death began to creep in, and the once bustling docks now seemed ominously quiet. Those who had known Calvin began to wonder, could anyone be next? For his family, the grief was all-consuming. Calvin's wife and children were left in a state of disbelief, unable to comprehend the suddenness of his death. They had been waiting for him to come home from another long night shift, never imagining that he would never walk through the door again. Calvin had always been the rock of the family, the one who provided stability in an often chaotic world. Now, his absence left a hole that no one seemed able to fill. Calvin's wife, in particular, struggled with the stark reality of his death. In the days that followed, she found herself sifting through the fragments of his life, searching for something, anything, that could explain why he had been taken from them. There had been no warning signs, no indication that he had been involved in anything that would put him in harm's way. His colleagues had nothing but praise for him, describing him as an unassuming man who was more focused on his work than on anything else. But the sudden, brutal nature of his death suggested something more. It wasn't just a random act of violence, it was personal, deliberate. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Calvin's death had not been an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger web of criminal activity that had been operating right under the noses of port authorities. The discovery of the rare bullets, the encrypted messages, and the falsified cargo manifests painted a picture of a sophisticated smuggling operation with deep ties to the port itself. The more the authorities uncovered, the more it seemed that Calvin had been a victim of circumstances beyond his control. The quiet longshoreman, who had spent his life working in the shadows, had found himself caught in a deadly game between powerful criminal forces. For the law enforcement officers assigned to the case, The immediate aftermath was one of confusion and frustration. The deeper they dug, the more complicated the investigation became. The connections between the smuggling ring, the logistics manager, and the other employees at the port suggested that Calvin had stumbled upon a network far more complex than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just the shipment of stolen goods and human trafficking. It was the corruption within the very system that was supposed to regulate and control the flow of goods into and out of the country. It was a system that had been infiltrated by criminals who were willing to kill to protect their operation. Despite these revelations, the investigation seemed to stall in the early days. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, fearful of the repercussions that might follow. Some employees began to distance themselves from the investigation, while others remained silent, their loyalty to the criminals they knew outweighing their allegiance to the authorities. Those who had information remained too afraid to speak, unsure of whom they could trust. Yet, despite the fear that loomed over the port, a few individuals began to step forward. Some coworkers, who had once turned a blind eye to the strange happenings at the docks, now recognized that the only way to stop the cycle of violence was to confront the truth. It was clear that the murder of Calvin Harris was not an isolated event, but a catalyst for exposing a much larger conspiracy. The port, once seen as a place of hard work and opportunity, was now a battleground for control, where lives were at stake and secrets ran deep. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Calvin's death was only the beginning. The immediate aftermath, filled with grief, fear, and uncertainty, was only a prelude to the larger story that was still unfolding. With each new piece of evidence, the true scale of the criminal enterprise began to take shape. And as the authorities pushed forward, the question remained: who else would be dragged into the dark underworld of the port? And how far would those responsible go to keep their secrets buried? As the investigation continued, the authorities began to piece together the scattered evidence, each clue pulling them closer to the truth. The tire pattern found on the burned-out car had been the first breakthrough, a small, seemingly inconsequential detail that would soon prove to be the key to solving the case. Detectives learned that the tire, with its unique defect pattern, was a rare brand not commonly found in the area. This discovery immediately drew attention to the local mechanic, a man with an established reputation for working on high-end vehicles and a network of connections in the criminal world. But it wasn't just the tire that linked the mechanic to Kellen's death. As investigators dug deeper into the mechanic's financial records, they found evidence of large, unexplained cash deposits in the days leading up to Kellen's murder. These deposits were flagged for further scrutiny, and soon a disturbing pattern emerged. The money appeared to be tied to the mechanic's activities with individuals connected to local gangs. With this financial link, the investigators' suspicion grew. This was no ordinary murder. It was a crime orchestrated by someone with a deep connection to organized crime. Despite the growing evidence against him, there was still one crucial piece missing. Investigators needed more than just circumstantial evidence. They needed to catch the mechanic in the act. As luck would have it, a hidden garage camera, which had been installed in the mechanic's shop for security purposes, would provide the breakthrough they needed. The footage, though not immediately discovered, would later become the key to sealing the case. When the hidden footage was finally reviewed, it revealed a chilling scene. The mechanic, his face obscured by shadows, was seen in the garage shortly before the fire was set. In the footage, he is clearly seen repainting the vehicle. the same vehicle that had been used to run Kellen down, and that would later be found burned in the field. The act of repainting the car was deliberate, a way to mask its identity and destroy any traces of evidence that could link it to the crime. This footage confirmed what investigators had suspected all along. The mechanic had been directly involved in Kellen's murder, working to cover his tracks and orchestrate a crime that would leave no trace. The discovery of the footage sent shockwaves through the investigation. The mechanic, once a suspect, was now unequivocally tied to the crime. The pieces of the puzzle that had seemed so scattered were now falling into place, and the authorities had the evidence they needed to make an arrest. The tire pattern, the cash deposits, the hidden camera footage, all of it pointed to the mechanic as the mastermind behind Kellen's murder. The question, however, remained. Why? Why had Kellen, a man with no apparent connection to the criminal underworld, been targeted by someone so deeply entrenched in organized crime? Investigators speculated that Kellen's growing involvement with mechanic had made him a liability. Perhaps he had unknowingly discovered something he wasn't meant to know, or maybe his loyalty had been tested by forces he didn't fully understand. Whatever the reason, Kellen had paid the ultimate price, and the town was left to reckon with the harsh reality of the hidden dangers that had lurked beneath its peaceful facade. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Kellen's family was faced with the heartbreaking truth. The man who had been so beloved in the community had not died by accident. His death had been a cold, calculated act, one that was orchestrated by someone who had manipulated him into a dangerous position. The closure that the family sought was within reach, but the loss they felt could never be undone. With the mechanic's involvement now confirmed, the investigation was set to take the next step, making an arrest and bringing him to justice. But as the authorities prepared for the next phase, the case of Kellen Brooks had already become a stark reminder of how easily a life can be lost to forces beyond one's control. The arrest of the mechanic marked the final step in the investigation, but the consequences of Kellen Brooks' murder reached far beyond the legal ramifications. The town, once calm and serene, was left shaken by the revelation of the hidden dangers lurking beneath its surface. What had seemed like an isolated tragedy was, in fact, part of a broader criminal network that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The arrest was not just about holding one individual accountable, but about uncovering the layers of corruption and crime that had taken root in the very fabric of the community. For Kellen's family, the pursuit of justice brought both a sense of closure and profound sadness. The truth behind Kellen's death had been revealed, and while it offered some measure of comfort, it could not undo the pain of losing him. His mother, still grieving the loss of her son, struggled to come to terms with the fact that his life had been stolen by a system of crime that had used him as a pawn. Kellen's siblings, too, faced the harsh reality that the man they had loved and admired had been caught in a web far beyond their understanding. The community, meanwhile, was left to reflect on its own role in allowing such dark forces to operate in the shadows. Many began to question their own assumptions about the safety of their town and whether they had overlooked signs of trouble for too long. The mechanic, once a familiar figure in the community, was now seen as a symbol of the dangers that could lie hidden even in the most unsuspecting places. As the legal process unfolded, the focus shifted to the consequences that awaited the mechanic. With the evidence stacked against him, his fate seemed sealed, and the town braced itself for the trial. But for Kellen's family, the pursuit of justice would never fully erase the pain. His loss remained a gaping hole in their lives, a reminder of the fragility of safety and trust in a world where danger could strike without warning. Now, As the investigation comes to a close, we ask you, the audience, to reflect on the case. What does Kellen's story tell us about the invisible threats that can exist in even the most seemingly quiet communities? How can we better protect ourselves and those we love from the dangers that often hide in plain sight? We invite you to share your thoughts and engage in the discussion as we continue to unravel the complexities of crime and justice.